Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm happy to introduce today Professor Andres Velasco, who has an outstanding career in both research and teaching public policy and implementing in it practice. So Dr. Velasco led the Chilean Ministry of Finance in year 2006 till 2010, when he was chosen the Latin American Finance Minister of the Year and the most innovative leader of the year. He was instrumental in developing so-called Santiago principles for sovereign wealth funds. He taught at Harvard University and Columbia University and continues to consult Inter-American Development Bank, IMF, World Bank, and governments of different countries. So first time we met with Professor Andres Velasco in year 2003. It was in Almaty, and Professor visited with even the dream team of Harvard University those time, Kazakhstan, and helped us to navigate economic policy those time, and visited both Almaty and city of Astana. When the London School of Economics decided to create own School of Public Policy, Professor Velasco became the inaugural dean of the school, a position he holds today. So he knows very well the economies of emerging markets. I think that we've all admired his work when he been a Minister of Finance. So he knows very well about Stabilization Fund in Chile. He knows about competitiveness agenda very well. And also, I think would be interesting to ask questions about new stages of the pension reform in Chile. So he will be interviewed by AFC's chief economist, Bauer Biktimir.
Thank you, Governor. Thank you for the introduction. And Professor Velasco, today we're discussing markets in disrupted world. I think the very first obvious question would be, what effect, in your opinion, the crisis will have on developing countries like Kazakhstan?
Thank you, Bauer. Thank you to the Governor for that very kind and generous introduction. I think you've started precisely on the right note, because we should be focusing on what the crisis is going to do to developing and emerging markets. First of all, the crisis came later than it did Europe, and as a result, we're behind the curve. We're not yet in stage 2, which is living with the virus. We're still in stage 1, which is trying to contain the virus, and this is true all over Africa, all over Asia, and certainly in my part of the world, Latin America. But in addition, we have to understand that for emerging markets and developing countries, this is not just one shock. It is really 5 shocks. To the initial medical shock, you have to add a collapse in world trade. The World Trade Organization is saying that trade will shrink by 1/3 or more this year. Second, a collapse in commodity prices, which of course in the case of Kazakhstan with energy prices is a very sensitive subject matter. Thirdly, for many countries, tourism and remittances, 2 very big sources of income, are gone. This is particularly important in parts of Asia, in Central America, and the Caribbean. And last but not least, we've seen big capital outflows from emerging markets since the virus hit in March. So it's those 4 plus a medical emergency, 5 shocks at once. Now, the difficulty, of course, is that for most emerging markets, it is simply not possible to do what the rich countries are doing. I was in an OECD forum earlier today, and you see numbers being thrown around. OECD countries, particularly in Europe and North America, are doing support packages to the tune of 10, 12, 15, 18% of GDP. Most emerging markets do not have the fiscal room to do that. We certainly don't have the central banks and can just print currency to finance that. And therefore, we have the unlucky combination of a shock that is going to be bigger and a policy response that inevitably is going to be smaller. As a result, I think there's a good risk that many emerging markets around the world will be in a prolonged recession. And we have to work hard to make sure that we're not set back in the goals of reducing poverty and reducing inequality that many countries had been making some progress on, and which today are in very, very big danger of being set back a few years, maybe a decade.
Thank you. And for Kazakhstan, because Kazakhstan has relatively ample fiscal space. We have the reserves, and this is similar to the national fund like yours, the Copper Fund in Chile. Given that we have some space, given that we have some room for maneuver, what should we be focusing on, in your opinion?
I think there's three issues that a country like Kazakhstan or a country like Chile having fiscal space should be focusing on. The first one you might call disaster relief. When you have a natural disaster, when you have an earthquake, when you have a flood, government, society helps those who have lost their homes, who've lost their incomes. And this is important because if the government is saying do not go to work because it is not safe, I think there's a social duty to compensate those that have lost incomes. Block two, you might call preservation of viable employments and viable firms. Many firms in Kazakhstan or in Chile or in many emerging markets are completely profitable and viable under normal circumstances, but for 2, 3, 4, 6 months, we don't know how many, cannot work normally because of lockdowns, of social distancing, etc. So we want them to remain alive. We want them to keep paying their employees, to paying their suppliers, paying their creditors, and for that they need liquidity. And governments typically have faced this second need through a mixture of transfers and loans. An expansionary policy on the part of the central bank, coupled with very targeted efforts to make sure that the money gets to where it has to go, namely companies of all sizes, and particularly the smaller companies, which tend to be cut off from financial markets. And then block three, which is not for today, but which is maybe for the end of the year or early next year, is stimulating demand to make sure that the economy can grow again. And I think in countries like yours or mine, where there's still big jobs ahead in terms of infrastructure for development, transition to the green economy, cleaning up our power, cleaning up our infrastructure, there may be a win-win situation. You could use part of that fiscal space to invest more, invest in infrastructure, and particularly invest on infrastructure that is green and good for the environment. That gives you the first win, that is to say jobs, and gives you the second win, which is a more sustainable future. A country like Kazakhstan, which has the fiscal space, ought to be thinking in those terms, I think.
Thank you. But interestingly enough, because I was just listening to another conversation between David Solomon and David Rubenstein, and David Rubenstein said, this is arguably, of course, that the crisis did not create any new paradigm. It only accelerated the trends that we used to have before. And in light of this, first, do you agree or not? And in light of this, do you think that countries like ours, like Kazakhstan and Chile, should have been focusing on this specific issue, like infrastructure or providing good, well-paid jobs, regardless of crisis? I mean, is that the long-term policy for us right now?
I think providing jobs and having good roads and good ports and good airports is always a good policy. And one might hope that the additional stimulus, whether economic or political, to make those changes will come with the crisis. But in trying to guess what the long-lasting consequences of the crisis, I'd say two things. First, it is way too early to tell, in the sense that we do not know, for instance, how long-lasting the recession will be. As a result, we do not know what the long-lasting damages to some sectors will be. It is obvious that in the short run, sectors like air transport or hospitality, hotels, tourism are very badly hit. Will that be the case a year or no from now? I do not know. It is also obvious that I think what we're doing right now, we will keep doing. We have learned that we can do part of our work from a distance, and that is good from a productivity gain, but it, like most good things in life, it has a B side, a more difficult side, which is the world will increasingly be divided among those like us who have high human capital, who have jobs that can be done from home or at a distance, and then factory workers, service workers, people who work in a shopping mall or in a restaurant who have to be there for work. And I think it's going to be very key for governments to make sure that those people who do not have the luxury of working from home, working from distance, do not feel like they're being left behind. But above all, let us be careful about predictions. I have a colleague here at London who is at the LSE, who is a professor of psychology, and he was saying that there's a big risk of what psychologists call confirmation bias. People who don't like capitalism will say, oh, the virus confirms that capitalism is doomed. That's not evident. People who don't like democracy will say, oh, the virus will confirm that democracy is doomed. We have no evidence for that either. I think rather than making big predictions, I'd say, and I'll end here, let us keep in mind that old cliche that a crisis is an opportunity we should not waste. And in those changes you mentioned at the outset, Bauer, like providing better quality jobs, tweaking industrial policy to make sure that it creates jobs, tweaking labor market regulation to make sure that it creates good jobs, well-paying jobs, stable jobs. We should have been doing that before, and ideally the crisis will give us a little push to do even more of that as we go forward.
Great. So there's a big challenge for the governments across the world just to adopt their public policies. And I also want to ask this question because you had such an exemplary career in both policymaking and teaching, and you still consult many of the governments. But for many years, your passion, your primary profession was to teach and do research. And I know when LSE a few years ago decided to create the School of Public Policy, they invited you to be the first inaugural dean. So could you share why, in your opinion, LSE has decided that it's important to have such a school? And why, in your personal opinion, why do you think, why it is your passion? Why do you spend so much energy in working in this specific field? Because we're working in this as well, and I just need more inspiration from you, I guess.
Thank you, Bauer. That's a very kind and very timely question. There are two things that we're trying to achieve with the new School of Public Policy at the LSE. The first one is remind the world that good public policies matter, and that for those good public policies to be good, effective, we need expert knowledge. When you have a toothache, you go to a dentist. When the world suffers from a pandemic, we have seen President Trump or Prime Minister Johnson in the UK, who had been very critical of experts, suddenly turning to experts, because you need expert knowledge to make sure that things work. And that's why at the LSE, we're very keen on training future public officials who know economics, who know statistics, who know how to tell reliable from unreliable empirical evidence, who know political science, sociology, law, etc. But that's only half the task. The other half of the task is to make sure that we train future public servants who can operate in a political environment. After all, a good public servant is not simply a technician. A good public servant is someone who can go out there and speak to the population, do a television interview, give a speech, go on social media, explain what a government is doing, explain why that is a good idea, persuade, cajole, convince, somebody who's in a position of policy making is, the Americans like to say the president is the commander-in-chief. I like to say that a good minister is an explainer-in-chief. So the second thing we want to achieve at the LSE is to have a broad, rounded curriculum which allows students to acquire those other skills, to write effectively, to communicate effectively, to understand the workings of a political process, so that they can not only design good public policies, but in fact see them through, get them approved politically, and interact with the population in a way that is as effective and as participatory as possible.
And what about yourself? Is it that something you share and something that you try to also pass on to your colleagues and the students?
Well, very much so. I think we're all prisoners of our personal histories and circumstances. I grew up in the Chile of the 70s and 80s, which was a very traumatic era for Chile. Chile was the model democracy of South America. We lost our democracy in 1973. Then we had 3 huge economic crises in the 70s and in the 80s. So, a young person back then, many of us grew up thinking, well, what went wrong in my country and how do we make sure it will not happen again? That reflection led me into the social sciences. I studied political philosophy as an undergraduate, economics as a graduate student, trying to understand what is the combination of philosophy, history, politics, economics, mathematics and statistics, other disciplines that are necessary to make sure our societies work well and that they have leaders who can actually do their jobs adequately, properly. And again, it is partially a matter of technical knowledge. It is absolutely key. We've seen it in this crisis, but you also need all those other skills that enable societies to have a dialogue, to engage citizens in a participatory and democratic way, and to get public policies that will be effective, among other things, because they have broad support in the population.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think on LinkedIn, I saw this quote from Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, that she was saying that pro-growth policies, which result in worsening social outcomes, are not good. And I think this also has to do with the public policy. And I have a very specific question, because Chile has been successful with quite a number of economic reforms. And you were heading the reform on the Copper Fund. And then before that, it was the Chilean pension reform, which actually set an example for our pension reform. And this is about also income redistribution, about creating more equal society. So what's your opinion, looking at what happened, it was an 80th thing in Chile, how would you measure the success, and how important it is to have this policy that would create more income redistribution and hopefully more social justice as well?
Thank you for that good and interesting question, Bauer. You began by mentioning the Prime Minister of New Zealand, and I think that's very apropos, very adequate, because it links the previous discussion we had with this one. I think Jacinda Ardern is a very good example of a leader who's technically capable, but who also understands those other virtues, the politics, the communication, the persuasion that are very necessary in modern societies. I think Chile is a country that has gotten many things right and also a few things wrong. And we're happy to share both our successes and our failures with the rest of the world. I think Chile, first of all, is a country that very proudly became democratic again. And I think the years since the recovery of democracy in 1980 have been probably the best years in Chilean history. Chile dates back to 1810. But I dare say that the combination of personal freedom, economic growth, growing prosperity, a middle class that is much larger than it used to be, many of those achievements are achievements of the democratic period. We have also understood that good public finance, good macroeconomics is a necessary condition for progress, and this is something that I know that in Kazakhstan you've thought about a lot. With the governor, we've had discussions in the past about the key importance of solid fiscal policies, a good monetary policy, a stable exchange rate, low inflation, etc. But in Chile, we have also understood that while macro stability is a necessary condition for development, it is not a sufficient condition, because you can be very stable and still stagnate. And two lessons from things that I think in Chile we have not done as well as we could have or should have is, first, to make sure that the growth is stable and sustainable, one has to diversify the sources of that growth, especially if, like Kazakhstan or Chile, you are a commodity exporter, because commodities have lots of advantages, but you know full well in Kazakhstan the risks of the Dutch disease, currency overvaluation, the difficulties of having other non-traditional exports grow. I think we do not need a hands-off policy. We very much need a hands-on policy of promoting diversification very actively. And we also learn in Chile, this is the second lesson, that equality requires good jobs at good wages, and that means that when it comes to the labor market and to social protection policies, including pension policy, it cannot simply be hands-off again. There are countries with labor markets that work very well, for instance, Scandinavia. There are lessons there. We have in Chile, and I know the governor is very interested in this, a private contribution system, which has some strengths. It's promoted savings, it's depoliticized to some extent the pension process, but which also has failures, the most important of which is that it's traditionally left many people outside the system or with very small savings and therefore small pensions. So here again, I think one has to be pragmatic. Chile is heading toward a mixed pension system in which there is a very big role for individual accounts and individual savings, but in which government also plays a role of insurer of last resort, if you want, helping provide a minimum pension for people who have not been able to save, who've been hit by bad luck, by bad health, by bad jobs, etc., etc. So it is in that pragmatic, problem-solving approach with growth and distribution very much at the center that countries can prosper. And as I say, there are a few things in Chile that I think the world can learn from. And there are a few things that we didn't do quite right and we're trying to fix now. And we can also all learn jointly from that process.
So hopefully we'll do that as well. And very last question from me. You were talking about diversity, and in these talks, in the AFD special conversation, we talked to leaders about diversity, how they exercise in different levels. And in your case, I was reading through your biography, and I'm really interested because you've written numerous articles and research pieces and essays, but you also have written 2 novels. And I was just interested, how do you balance it, especially in the beginning of your career, how do you used to balance this personal development and your work? And because it's really interesting, it's really inspiring. Could you share?
Thank you.
How it happened?
Well, yes, I have 2 novels. They're out. People listening can download them from Amazon, the ebook. I have to confess, Bauer, that I think I have found over the years that I'm a better economist than I am a novelist. But writing is one of the passions of my life. And of course, you can write fiction, but you can also write essays. You can write nonfiction. You can write papers. I have found writing to be one of the joys of my life and one of the things that brings different aspects of my life together. Because, as Keynes said many, many years ago, a good economist or a good leader in policy, he didn't put it this way, but I think he would have agreed with this, needs to be in part historian, in part mathematician, in part philosopher, and in part persuader in chief, as we're just saying. And as I mentioned in thinking about the plans we have at the London School of Economics, those are things that one has to teach students who want to be in positions of leadership. A broad curriculum, the capacity to communicate, the capacity to write clearly, the capacity to speak going to the point and without meandering, the capacity to communicate across cultures and different languages are absolutely key today. And you mentioned diversity. One shortcoming of many governments is precisely lack of diversity, lack of points of view, which is not simply because governments hire the wrong people, although sometimes they do. It is because in many countries, those who get the privilege of a high-level education, of high-level training in economics or politics or mathematics or engineering, tend to be people from a narrow spectrum of society. So I think everybody, and certainly at the London School of Economics, we see it that way. A big part of our job is to make sure that we have the finance, we have the means, we have the doors that are wide open to be able to recruit people from not only different countries, we have 42 different nationalities in the school that I lead, but also people from different socioeconomic backgrounds. Because a country will have good leaders when the leaders are representative of that nation. When one group, whether ethnic or economic, monopolizes positions of power, then I think inevitably the quality of policies will suffer. So that's a very, very good question. I've thought a lot about this. We're trying to make some progress at the LSE, but clearly all of us have a long and important way to go in improving this.
Thank you. Thank you. It was really inspiring, and I would love to thank you for this really interesting discussion. I hope our viewers would be also inspired to study public policy. Maybe some of them will apply to LSE. But here we're concluding our session, and thank you, everyone, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
Bye. Сейчас заканчиваю.